Good evening, everyone. My name is David McGowan. I am the CEO here at WJCT Public Media and proud parent of Jacksonville Today. And I am so delighted to see you all in this room tonight. I've got a couple of people to introduce, but before that, I want to just extend a very warm welcome to Dean Cobb and thank him for being here and joining us this evening. And with that, also I also want to say a special thank you to the Jessie duPont Fund. The Jessie duPont Fund, under the leadership of Mari Qureshi, has such an important driving force in making good things happen here in Jacksonville. And we are very proud to be their partner and very grateful for the support that they provide to Jacksonville Today. And so I'd like to ask Mari to come up and say a few words.
I'm afraid I'll do something to the microphone if I...
That was just mean, wasn't it?
Okay. Hi, I'm Mari Qureshi of the Jessie duPont Fund, and I won't keep you waiting for Dr. Jelani Cobb, but I just wanted to express my thanks to all of you here in this room. You must be here because you care about independent journalism, so thank you. And it is my great pleasure to have invited Dr. Cobb here. We at the Jessie duPont Fund have long supported the duPont Awards at Columbia University. And, shame on me for not knowing, but the duPont Awards, for those of you who haven't heard, is one of the premier broadcast awards in the industry. And Dr. Cobb's team, does all the judging and annually awards the best investigative journalism, broadcast journalism in the country. And it's been such a pleasure to get to know him. And I was so pleased when he agreed to come to Jacksonville. So you have a treat for you tonight.
Thank you, Mari. I hope that all of you took the opportunity, those of you who are not Jacksonville Today subscribers already, to subscribe on your way in, and that if you did not do that, that you'll take a moment to do that before you leave this evening. Our aim at Jacksonville Today is to produce and distribute the local news and information that allows all of us, everyone, to participate in our civic conversation, and that fosters a vibrant, engaged, and inclusive community. And this evening is certainly part of that work. A couple of procedural notes here. We are going to take questions a little bit later in the evening. You have some note cards on the seats in front of you, and please, if you do have questions, please use those to write that down. At some point this evening, you'll see some folks kind of walking through the room looking to collect those. And so please look for them to get those questions in. So Will Brown. Will Brown is a reporter for Jacksonville Today and a Report for America fellow. His work, his writing and photography have covered places in Jacksonville that are often the least represented places in our region. And in doing that work, he has often found himself to be the only reporter on the ground there. His writing has become known for its embrace of history and his photography for its artistry. He was born in Sarasota, raised in Brevard County, a proud graduate of Florida A&M University, the master's from USF, a Florida man through and through. I give you Will Brown.
Good evening. Good evening. You are here to listen to a journalist whose first name is William. A person who is the son of a Georgia man who earned an undergraduate degree from a historically black university and sports a beautiful salt and pepper beard. That person's not me. I am Will Brown. I am joined by Dr. Jelani Cobb. He is a Peabody Award-winning documentarian for his work on the 2020 PBS Frontline production, Whose Vote Counts? He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist for commentary, who is a staff writer for The New Yorker, as well as the Henry R. Luce Professor of Journalism and the Dean of the Columbia Journalism School. Dean Cobb earned his undergraduate degree from Howard University. From Howard University, as well as his master's and doctorate degrees from Rutgers. He is a native New Yorker who has earned fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, as well as the Shorenstein Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is an author, a scholar, a gentleman who joins us this evening. Everyone, please welcome Dean Jelani Cobb. Thank you.
So I appreciate the hospitality because I was aware that I was coming deep into Rattler territory. So.
Well, first, I just want to express our sincere appreciation for the Celebration Bowl because I was concerned that the Rattlers might not win. But
so I will say this, with no shame. In my years at Howard, I don't think we ever beat you all, if I remember correctly.
See, but that's funny because in my years at FAM, I remember us losing to Howard on y'all's homecoming, and I was distraught.
Yeah.
And I was like, how did we lose to Howard?
Wow.
Wait.
See, it's very fun. Because I'm a well-trained Howard man, I'm going to be gracious in the face of such disrespect. But
it's all love between the HBCUs. I always like to say we get jokes off, but if someone talks about Howard, I will be ready to fight right next to the Bison.
Likewise.
So we're going to start with the first question. Speaking of Howard, the late Vernon Jordan, once said, "I'm here because I stand on the many shoulders." On many shoulders, and that's true of every black person I know who has achieved. What are the things that you now share with mentees now that that your mentors shared with you?
So I'll say a couple things. First, I want to say that I speak fairly often in front of large groups of people. I never get nervous. I was perfectly calm this evening until Dr. Cole walked in. And so if you're talking about mentors, when Mari and I were first talking, this is shortly after I became dean, and we realized that we knew Dr. Cole in common, and she said, "Wait, are you another one of Dr. Cole's mentees?" And I said, "That term, mentee, generally applies to everyone she has met, because she has imparted, so much wisdom and so much insight and given so much support and advice to so many of us that, it's just, an honor to be here in your presence." And so, and I'm going all the way back to when I was an assistant professor, when I was my first year as a professor at Spelman. And so very much indebted to Dr. Cole here. In terms of what my mentors, imparted to me, that I in turn try to impart, a lot of what I learned, specifically at Howard, which I later learned was a general theme at HBCUs, was that, I think Toni Morrison, said it most succinctly, the purpose of freedom is to free others. And that we were taught very explicitly that if we were the primary beneficiaries of our talents, then they had failed. That we were being educated in order to be of service to other people. And so, in the journalism arena, I think that's very straightforward for us. Why are we doing this? what are we here for? What is our mandate? If you want to get attention, there are other ways to do it. If you want, the public to notice you, there are plenty of, we have social media, you can be an influencer, there are all kinds of things you can do. But the work that we are charged with as journalists is to be the voice for people who, but for us, would not be heard. And that's what we're here for.
And you started to go into that, but I really wanted to ask you to share with others your experience on the hilltop. How did that change your life?
Mm-hmm. So, I was kind of in and out. I was never really a staffer, or I didn't pursue the hilltop seriously. But the most substantial thing that I got from that really were relationships with people who were similarly interested in journalism, similarly interested in history. I've kind of followed a dual path, which is that, I'd earned a doctorate in American history and all the time was still doing journalism. And people didn't really understand how those two things were supposed to go together. I understood, but it was hard, at that point for people to kind of grasp what exactly it was that I was doing. And one of the things I think that's crucial, for us as journalists, is to be able to give context to the things that we report on. And another thing that I tell my students all the time, the news is not necessarily new. Sometimes it's a new iteration of an older issue, and we have to be able to tell the public succinctly, cleanly, quickly what's happening right now, but also relate that to what happened yesterday, what happened last year, what happened 10 years ago. And so that was what I was doing, and there were like-minded folk around at Howard, in and around the hilltop. Probably the most notable of those is Ta-Nehisi Coates, but who, we became close friends at Howard. But also, Natalie Moore, who's, a great reporter at WBEZ, and this Natalie Hopkins. I could go through the whole kind of list of people who were around then, and those kind of formative relationships are really crucial.
And speaking of relationships, and I think back to some of my days on the FAMU and staff, but I wanted to speak. You were mentioning relationships and context, and you grew up in South Jamaica, Queens.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned that. You've mentioned a number of times that you have a PhD, and your father's from Hazelhurst, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I think I once heard you say that if someone knows where Hazelhurst is, they might be related to you.
No, so I said, if you have heard of Hazelhurst, you are my cousin. And so,
I don't think we're related, but I have heard of Hazelhurst.
Okay.
The one person I know from Hazelhurst is now a pastor.
Really?
Yes.
That might be my cousin, seriously. No, my cousin is a pastor in Hazelhurst. So.
His name is James Earl. I was like, wow, okay. But Hazelhurst is the county seat of a county named after Jefferson Davis.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
When did you believe that the professional life that you have now as Dean of the Columbia Journalism School was possible from your roots, especially like the roots your dad had?
So I think this is a very common story, certainly a very common story for Black people who I talk to. And as I have gotten kind of out into the world and interacted in different contexts, it's a common story for lots of other people as well. But, first off, I think that a good portion of parenting is manipulation, which, I didn't know, which you don't know. And I always tell my students, I was like, you think that you're going to get away from your parents, but they had a whole decade to kind of encode you before you realized what was going on, around you. And so, my father, who, had a third grade education, when I was a child, whenever he came home from work or if he had gone somewhere, he would come home and he would bring me a gift. The gift he would give me was always the same thing. It was always a writing pad and sometimes a pen or a pencil. And literally the first memory I have in life is of him teaching me the alphabet. Like, that's the oldest thing that I can remember, like him wrapping his hand around. Now, I didn't know what that meant, but for a person who wrote in an awkward scrawl to see his son mastering the alphabet. That was a different thing. And it's for my mother, who grew up in Jim Crow, Bessemer, Alabama. And I can say a lot of us, I think, can probably relate to this. Every single thing that I've ever achieved in my life has been a kind of vengeance tour to get what my parents were denied.
Mm.
And that's what it is. And the last thing I'll say about this is that when I got my doctorate, I gave it to my mother at graduation. I never took it back because that was what that was for.
My undergraduate degree sits at my mom's house.
Mm-hmm.
I've never in my life possessed it.
Yeah, because it's not yours.
Nope, not at all.
Not really. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned being a writer, and you've been a writer at the New Yorker for 2012 and on the staff since 2015, and you've published countless stories. Which one's your favorite? Which one sticks with you?
Probably the first one, and there's a Florida connection here. So one part of my family is in South Florida. So my father's family was in Hazelhurst, Georgia, and then like part of that branch relocated to South Florida. And so, we have these Florida connections. The first thing that I ever wrote for the New Yorker in 2012, I was on the news comment desk, and it was about this news blip of a young man who had been killed, and there had been no arrest in the case. And it was kind of sketchy information. It was like a classic internet phenomenon. And so I kind of started digging into what was going on there. And I talked to my aunt, who lived at the time in Miami, and she was telling me about Sanford County, my aunt who was a sociologist, actually. And she said, I did the compliance training. She did DEI training. Yeah, I know.
We'll get to that.
People chasing DEI people in the streets now. And so she did the DEI training at the Sanford courthouse. So all the, court employees, she had done about a year before that. And so she was just giving me the kind of background of Sanford. And so the first thing that I ever wrote for the New Yorker was a story about the contrast of this 17-year-old boy named Trayvon Martin being killed at the same time that there was the first black president. And so it was called Trayvon Martin and the Parameters of Hope.
I remember that night because the NBA All-Star Game was about 20 minutes away in Orlando, Florida. And so many people were like, look at all these mostly black men celebrating them, championing them since they were teenagers. And 20 minutes away. It's funny. I was scared to wear hoodies for many, many years after that. It wasn't until I think my child was a few years old that I finally started wearing hoodies outside of my house.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like that question about like how you respond, to these ideas. Because I mean, one thing that I don't know if you've had this experience, but we're about the same height. It's very difficult. Or there are difficulties associated with being a large black man who wants to be respected for how you think.
Yes.
Because there are more than one thing I'll tell you, like, which people are always surprised to hear, and I'm saying this, like, people are gonna probably tell me they don't want to hear anything else from me. I know almost nothing about football. I know far less about football than the average American. But it was a kind of rebellion because so many people were pushing me into football. And I was like, I do not want to play football. I want to write books, And then I now know that those two things were not mutually exclusive. But to my like adolescent brain, it kind of turned me off, from that. And so that was kind of like, even to this day, I will tell you another Florida story, which is that in college, I was dating a young woman who invited me to meet her family at Thanksgiving. And I met her family. Her father was this very prominent and imposing pastor. Didn't say a word to me, not a word. And I'm just kind of sitting there feeling awkward. And then it's like Thanksgiving, so like all the men are in the room watching football. No one is talking to me. And then finally, her father looks over to me and says, "What position did you play?" And I said, "Yeah, I didn't play football." Everybody in the room in unison said, "You didn't play football?" But they said it in the same tone of voice as, "You don't love your mama."
But it's funny because when I tell people I play football, I'm tall and kind of big, and I say, yeah, I played football in high school and walked on in college and all this other stuff. And, okay, so you were a linebacker? Were you this or were you that? I was like, no, I was the kicker. The kicker? What?
How does that work? Right.
Right. Black kickers. But I always joke it's every mother's favorite position.
Well, that's true.
We talk about children and the reality of being, frankly, large black men. And in my case, I'm rearing a child who will be even bigger than me.
Me too.
We both have children about elementary school aged, and 6 months ago, Dr. Celeste Watkins Hayes, Dean of the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, sat right here in this seat in August. And of all people, she was speaking with Dr. Cole and others. One of my takeaways from that conversation was that she mentioned that people never know the seeds that they are planting 20 or 30 years down the road into the future. What seeds would you say have been planted since the January 6th insurrection that will bear fruit when our children are old enough to hold federal office?
So, listen, there are a few things that we have to kind of have as a grounding. One is that I'm from Queens, and this is significant for a very particular reason. Donald Trump is also from Queens, and he's from a place called Jamaica Estates. I grew up in a place called South Jamaica. Those two neighborhoods have exactly the relationship you would suspect based upon their names. Jamaica Estates was literally at the top of a hill. South Jamaica was at the bottom of the hill. Jamaica Estates was overwhelmingly upper class, overwhelmingly white. South Jamaica, overwhelmingly black and brown, working class community. And so we kind of understood, who he was, a long, long time ago. And part of who he is was shaped by the era that he grew up in. So he's about a generation older than me. And one salient point about Queens is that, one of the things I'm very proud of in terms of being from there, it is statistically the most diverse county in the United States. There are approximately 800 languages spoken in Queens. Astoundingly diverse place. When Donald Trump grew up, Queens was the second whitest county of New York City. So what happened in the interim? The 1965 Johnson Immigration Reform Act. And was just a flashover, revolutionized American immigration policy. And one of the first places that began to register was Queens. And as a matter of fact, I have a friend who is Indian American and a journalist, and she was talking about her family. We kind of were like, how did Queens begin to diversify before all these other places? She said, my family was like, we will come 6,000 miles to be in the United States, but then when we land, we will not go more than 5 miles from the airport. It's like, landed at JFK, this is America, good, close enough. And lots of other communities had that same sort of reaction. For some people, if you're old enough, you remember a show called All in the Family, set in Queens, with a character named Archie Bunker, who has an allergic reaction to the arrival of the black family next door called the Jeffersons. Norman Lear, who just recently passed away, was very explicit in that. He was chronicling the tensions that ultimately produced not only Donald Trump, but Donald Trump's generation in Queens. And so there was this language of nativism, of who are these people, where are they from. It's not coincidental that the most xenophobic politician in modern American history is a product of the most diverse county in the United States. There's a relationship between those two things. And so when we talk about January 6th, it was the culmination of these things, because by the time you get to 2016, it wasn't just white Queens residents who were saying, who were these people? Where are they from? Who are they praying to? What kind of food is that? It was a national phenomenon. And so people were speaking a language that Donald Trump had spoken his entire life. That's why he was so fluent in it. And so when we looked at January 6th, it was the culmination of those seeds of anti-democracy that went back at least a half century, because part of this is also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the same year as the Immigration Reform Act. And so in January 6th of 2021, what we saw was the kind of recognition, a mutual recognition of who they were, what they were capable of, that they had ranks, that there was this silent audience cheering them on in social media, around the country, and that these kind of far-right, anti-democratic forces, whose history goes all the way back to the founding of the country, were there to kind of stake their claim yet again. And so if you ask what we'll be dealing with, a generation from now, it's likely that we'll be dealing with the fallout that the same dynamics that generated January 6th in the first place, but they've always been here. And for us as journalists, this is the part where we get into history. We have to know this. We have to know the context of immigration and immigration law and resistance to immigration in the United States if we're going to cover immigration. We have to know the history of anti-democracy in the United States, which is a very long, vital, and vibrant tradition that we don't talk about because we have, as I say, cooked the history books. We only want to talk about the most progressive and impressive parts of our past. And so all of those things are, when I'm talking about what our journalism school has to teach, when we send our graduates out the door to go cover stories, they have to have all of this in their background, as they're, walking out to cover a beat.
And you bring up a great point about history, and I wanted to go there. The Duval County Public Schools is in the process of purchasing textbooks. Duval County, right here in Jacksonville, is in the process of purchasing textbooks for its social studies curriculum for the first time in 11 years. They said they waited a year because they were looking for more guidance from the Florida Department of Education, an organization that said over the summer that, quote, instruction includes how slaves developed skills in which some instances could be applied for their personal benefit, close quote. Their words, not mine. What are things that you believe children should know about American history by the time they graduate from high school?
So one thing I'll tell you, the jazz critic Stanley Crouch, who I first encountered, reading him when he wrote for Village Voice, once said that the two best things that happened to him in his career were being fired by the Village Voice and being hired by the Village Voice, in that order. And so he had a great turn of phrase. And when that AP curriculum was revised, actually, an article that I had written was one of the things that had been yanked out. And so it was like the honors were being removed from that syllabus and being included in that syllabus in that order. And so it was like, if you wanted it out, it must have been something true. And that must have been what the issue was. And so there's a lot. And I don't want to single out Florida because I think that all these things are national dynamics. But if we're talking about those specific instances, when they first began this, they were talking about just the local history, when we're talking about Harry Moore and Harriet Moore and them being killed when their home was firebombed in 1951 on Christmas Eve, and they were murdered for the crime of organizing black voters. They had been fired by the Florida Department of Education from their jobs as teachers for the crime of organizing black voters, and then murdered. And then to that Sanford County connection again, when Harry Moore died immediately, Harriet Moore lingered for 5 days. She died in the hospital in Sanford, Florida. And so in 1990-something, Florida added that house, their home, the site that their home had stood on, to the historic registry. So it was like the contradiction is that you can add this home to the historic registry, but you don't want your schools to teach why it's on the historic registry.
So I wanted to mention something about that, because that's a fantastic point. And when David mentioned that I'm a product of Brevard County Public Schools, the Moores were in Brevard County, Florida. And I graduated high school in Brevard County, Florida. And I remember I was a child, and I asked my dad one time, who were Harry and Harriet Moore? And I learned about the Moores because he said, oh, your aunt knew them. And then my aunt went and told me the whole story. I didn't learn a single word about Harry and Harriet Moore while a student in Brevard County Public Schools. There are students in St. Johns County. A couple of years ago, I interviewed them. I said, did you know Dr. King was arrested in St. Augustine? They looked at me like I had two heads. Like, really? And these were students who wanted to be engaged. They just didn't know. But speaking of the Florida Department of Education, yesterday, the Florida Department of Education permanently prohibited diversity, equity, and inclusion at colleges in the state. In the words of Marvin Gaye, what's going on?
So, what happened, that same sort of dynamic, like these ideas are not, disparate. When we saw, and I think that one of the reasons why we see such a concerted push in Florida is that, if people can win here, it sets a template for other places. And also the kind of political weight, this place with 39 electoral college votes, the huge sway, that especially even then the large market states, which we know, Florida, Texas, to some degree California, have a disproportionate influence on what's taught in American history books, American textbooks, because those are the biggest school systems. They're trying to, book publishers are trying to be amenable to the largest market, still capitalism. And so when we look at the attack on DEI, and it's another front of the attack. You remember we had people in hysterics about CRT, some years ago, and I was like, I've actually taught critical race theory, and I can guarantee you that what people are referring to critical race theory is not critical race theory at all. And so you create this hysteria, and under the cover of that hysteria, you get to ban books. And you get to put your thumb on the scale of education. And when we look at DEI, it's paired with the attack on affirmative action, which was successful, eviscerated affirmative action. And now, the push is to get rid of programs which were meant to essentially ensure that people had equity in their places of employment and of their places of education. And so it's really a kind of rearguard march to return America to a kind of Mad Men demographic, Mad Men era demographic. And it's not even hidden because people feel confident enough in this success that they're now saying what they're doing and telegraphing what they're doing. And so it's all a part of that. One of the things that I will say is one irony is that I wrote a piece for The New Yorker called The Man Behind Critical Race Theory, and it was about the legal scholar Derek Bell. And Derek Bell really, his scholarly work was driven by his years as a civil rights lawyer, filing desegregation cases in the 1960s in some of the most dangerous places in Mississippi. That's what he did. Brown versus Board of Education happens in 1954. It inspires him to become a lawyer. He goes to law school. Thurgood Marshall gives him his, not his first job, but his second job. And he is a soldier in the ranks of the civil rights movement. He is then bewildered by the persistence of racial inequality a decade after Brown, 2 decades after Brown, 3 decades after Brown. And so he then goes on this quest to understand how, in the face of all these legal precedents and all these legal victories, inequality persists. The body of questions that he raised is what became the basis of critical race theory. And one of the things that he said was that in a racially hierarchical society, people will use the language of colorblindness in order to reinforce racial hierarchies. And so for all the things that Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis and other people, who we could list, of all the things that they have done, I really think they should be most commended for validating the work of Derek Bell.
Spicy.
I mean, you ask.
So I did ask. There are still a few more moments to write your questions to us. We will read some of them to Dr. Cobb, as my mom, who is in the audience today, used to remind me, write legibly. So we will take questions. So if you have some, write them on your cards, and we will read them off. So real rapid fire a few as we go. So, all right. We're going to start with one that looks very well written. And what are digital platforms? We've kind of talked a lot about history. It's one thing to be a journalist, but if it's like if a tree falls in the woods and no one sees it, what digital platforms would you say? I lied. Maybe it's not that legible. What digital platforms do you see people getting their news from in the next 5 to 10 years?
Probably none that we know. Maybe TikTok will be around then. I highly doubt if X/Twitter will be. Facebook has moved away from that, altogether. And the platforms would rather not be in the news business, which is one of the reasons why there's so much pressure on the news industry to innovate about, how we deliver information to people. Twitter is, a cesspool, X is, I got off of it, because I just couldn't, at some point. But
better man than me.
Yeah, no, I just think it's not really that useful. But the other side of it is we haven't figured out the mode of dissemination that matches that, something that has the kind of breadth of contact. The whatever you want to say about the evils of the algorithms work. They have figured out some way to keep people engaged. And in news, we don't know how to quite navigate that yet.
And we have to get the information out there.
Sure.
Because without it, I mean, in some ways, what's the point?
Right.
But speaking of our industry, someone asked, their words, not mine, how do you decide which battles to fight as a black man in a white-dominated industry?
So, one of the, you raised a question earlier about things that your mentors have told you. One of the other things that a mentor of mine told me was that you have to pick your battles. You can't fight all of them, at the same time. And, another, guy, I was friends with this guy who was a boxing trainer, and he pointed out something. He was talking about Muhammad Ali, like all the great boxers. And he was like, if you notice, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you notice, when they fight, they only engage when they want to. It's like the fight happens on their terms. And it was like, okay, now we'll actually engage. Now we're not going to engage. And he was like, and that's actually kind of the way that you win. And so when we're looking at things, you're like, what are the resources available? What is the time? How pissed off am I about this? Who else is pissed off about this? Is there something that we can walk away from and deal with down the line? And is it urgent? Do we have to deal with it now? And some combination of those things determines, and then also it might just be like what mood you're in that day, which is part of it.
Headphones have been a godsend.
Right.
But speaking of journalism, another question from the crowd is it possible to be a journalist and an advocate at the same time?
So here's what I think, right? I think that we give people information for a reason. And we have a responsibility for that information to be vetted, to be as fair and as complete as we can. But we don't give people information in the abstract. Like if you expose, I always use this like example, if you expose the city council member who's taking a bribe, it's because you expect the public to demand that person resign, or for there to be a law enforcement investigation, or for there to be whatever. You expect something to happen. Now, I think the problem can be when you cross the line into telling the public what it's supposed to do. Like our job is to give people information with the faith that they can figure out what they should do with it. And that may not happen on the time frame that we want it to. But once we have done that, that's kind of where, now of course there is a tradition, I should say, there's a tradition of advocacy press in this country that is very important. The abolitionist press, was, crucial to the end, of slavery. The newspapers that pushed, for the 8-hour day or the 40-hour work week and all the kind of benefits that have happened and reforms that have happened in this country that were a product of the press that was specifically dedicated to pursuing a particular cause. I think that is important. But I also think that for people who are not explicitly that, so David Remnick, my boss at the New Yorker, said your politics should be hidden in plain sight. If you are going to make a political stand, that has to be, upfront. But if you are in the kind of mainstream reporting news business, and I think that students are very often surprised to hear me say that because so much of my work has been, kind of very, where I'm coming from, and I've done a lot of opinion work. And I was like, yes, at the New Yorker, if I had been at a different outlet, you would likely not know any of, what I thought about these things.
And, again, another question from the crowd. It's not too late, so please share them with us. Kind of looking into, you mentioned like the city council person taking a bribe. Our journalism students.
Why do you keep laughing when I say this?
Because she's on the city council.
I know that. Right, I'm aware of that.
So, that's the. Are journalism students interested in becoming investigative reporters, and how does the curriculum and the teaching experience kind of impact that type of reporting?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that my predecessor, brought to the journalism school was that all of our students take an investigative core. So no matter what it is, if you were interested in covering sports, if you're interested in covering immigration, if you're interested in covering like the entire spectrum of things that you can cover, you start with an investigative techniques core. And if you're really dedicated to investigative, there's another battery of courses that you can take to kind of fill out an investigative track. But the other part of it is that, fundamentally the work of being a journalist is to investigate things. When we say investigative journalists, it's almost a redundancy because we're supposed to be in the business of finding these things out or asking people or kind of like digging and getting the information that people don't necessarily want us to have.
I used to say this and people laugh at me, but I don't think they do now. Curiosity killed the cat, but paid the journalist.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
And I know I absolutely wore people out with the questions I asked them.
But good.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, you're calling me again? Yes.
Yeah.
Get used to it. But speaking of journalism, another question from the crowd. How would you describe the state of journalism today? And what is the public's role in journalism's success or failure?
By the way, speaking of the phone call thing, it reminded me one time we had a student who was new to journalism. She hadn't done journalism at all before, and we were telling her to press source. And it was like, did you call this source? And she said, yes. And it was like, when? And she said, yesterday. Like, did they call you back? She said, no. It's like, so what do you do? She's like, I'm going to call them back on like Thursday. And we're like, no, you call them every hour. Call them like until either they say, no, I don't want to talk to you, or like whatever it is, like you continue to call. It's like, isn't that rude? And I was like, so in any case, it also reminds me of this time we were talking, it was a group of journalists who were talking with a few people who were in the School of Public Affairs, who were former government folk, and they were talking about investigative people, and they were like, one person said incredulously, like, a reporter he just requested that someone give him confidential documents. And we were like, yeah. Could not believe. It's like, that's what we do, right? Now, of course, the other side of it is that just because you have a confidential document doesn't mean that you publish that confidential document. And that's actually where the journalism part of it comes in. And, maybe that document is, more use to you not published than it is published. All the other kind of things you go through in the calculations. To the question about the state of journalism, it's the best of times and worst of times. It's easy to see, and I said this, earlier, it's easy to see the worst of times part, the instability of the business model, the just evisceration of the journalism ranks, where, jobs are just kind of falling off the table. Publications, they're now local publications that have no reporters whatsoever. There are no reporters for the publication. And that landscape is bleak. And at the same time, we have the ability to do journalism that our mentors and their mentors could only dream of. We have access to incredible amounts of data. We all walk around with a device, in our pockets that has, more computing power than like the whole campus of MIT in the 1980s or wherever. We can, dig, we can get all this kinds of information. There's all this innovation happening about how we report, how we disseminate information. And we have to keep track of both of those things, the bleak side so that we understand, what's at stake, but also the really exciting, innovative side so we understand that we are not, defeated at this point.
And you're right, because the phone that I just pulled out has more computing power than the computer I took to college. And, I remember there was like a computer-assisted reporting class. Now, like if you told like a journalism student, yeah, this computer-assisted reporting class, they'd look at you like I looked at
it's
someone
called
with,
reporting.
Right.
Right.
What's the thing that people had in the 70s? Like they helped them count. I think it was like I can't remember, but like not an ad. It wasn't that. It wasn't that. But I think it was like a square line or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I missed that. All right.
But anyway, I just remember, there were times I'm like, wow, people did that? And it's like, yeah, so things evolve.
Right.
But, speaking of, journalism, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about trust and local news. This is a question from the audience. Whoever wrote it, thank you for writing legibly. With all the fake news, I despise that term, being broadcast, how do people, learn to trust media again?
So, one of the things I have said to my peers is that, we lament the decline of trust. We also have to be worthy of people trusting us, because we have seen egregious failures on the part of the press, and trust once lost is far more difficult to regain. That's the fundamental part of it. Our news very often has certainly class biases baked in, very often racial biases baked in, gender biases, a whole array of things. The things that come up very often inadvertently, and that is a huge impediment to us, building and regaining, the trust of the public. The other side of it is that fake news, whatever we want to call it, is not new. As a matter of fact, one of my colleagues at Columbia is the author of a book called Not Exactly Lying. And it's a history, basically, in every mode of communication, people have used it to spread false propaganda. Going back to the printing press, and then that gets updated to radio. It gets updated to television. It gets updated to the internet. That if people have access to the mode of communication, the means of communication, there's going to be a certain percentage of people who will use it for ill, to mislead the public. One of the things that I think has to happen on our part is the kind of consistent effort to gain, to show why we should be trusted. So one of the things I've said is that we should have, especially digitally, this is much easier than it would have been before, but we should have in anything that we publish, especially anything that has a serious accusation or anything that's investigative, and we should have a hyperlink that you click on that says how this story was reported. And simple. When I turn into something at the New Yorker, I have to turn in a raft of fact-checking stuff. Like, I got this from this, I interviewed this person, here's the audio of that interview, da-da-da-da-da-da. It should be, I got a tip anonymously, which led me to file this Freedom of Information Act request to get these documents, which led me to reach out to the commissioner of this particular agency who didn't want to talk to me, and so I waited and found that person when they were coming out to their car, and then this person told me this, blah 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 blah. So that if they, this is something that people in social science understood long ago, where historians require footnotes, to say, like, how can I verify this? Journalism has to say, if you were so inclined, you could produce this same article because this, and this are the sources I used to produce it.
I have found myself doing that far more. And regardless of what one thinks of the bills that are in Tallahassee at this moment and in the Florida legislature, I don't say this bill will do X. I say this bill, and directly quote the bill. Here's the link to the bill. Don't believe me. Here's the bill for yourself. Read it for yourself. Whether it's state legislation, local legislation, here's the link. Bill, how did you talk to this person? I called them. What's their number? Can't do that. But
right.
I called them. And you're right about just, that extra layer of transparency goes a very long way.
You can put the audio of the interview up when people want to know where a quote came from. Frontline, you mentioned Frontline earlier, this evening. Frontline is doing that now. Like, they'll put up a documentary, and then they will put up the entire interview with the person. So even if it's 2 hours or 4 hours, if you were so inclined, you can listen to that entire interview and see where the 30 seconds or minute or 90 seconds that they used of that 3-hour interview, you can see exactly where it came from. So it's like, when we're in school, your teacher said to show your work.
I mean, that's what I say all the time. Cite your source.
Yeah.
And this is one, I'm going to come back to the audience questions, but this is one I really wanted to ask you to that vein about trust. What can local journalists do to elicit more conservative trust? Because so many,
here's the thing, right? When we kind of disaggregate the trust part of it, one part, there's always a certain kind of reaction, even in the best of circumstances, that part of our job is to tell people things that they don't want to hear. And one of our instinctive reactions as human beings is to disavow things that we dislike. Like, that's not true. And so that's part of what we're going against. But I also think that it's crucial. One, I think that institutions have to be above reproach. That we have to make sure that every day we're doing our best to make sure that we live up to the standard that we've set. And when we fail to live up to that standard, we have to be upfront. We messed up. We won't do it again. We're on top of it, so on and so forth. But as it pertains to the erosion of trust, that is an asymmetrical phenomenon. So there are people who are liberals and progressives who trust the media less than they used to, and there are way more conservatives who distrust the media. Like those numbers, that's really what's driving the distrust. But when you talk about how local news rebuilds trust, here's the thing. On the ground, those numbers look different, even for conservatives. So people trust local news for reasons that are really not that hard to figure out. They trust local news more than they trust national institutions. Also, the historical part of this is useful. Americans have never trusted large institutions. If we go back to the Grapes of Wrath era, they distrusted the banks. If we went back 50 years before that, they distrusted the railroads, which were the major kind of companies and the kind of dominant economic powers of their day. As it stands now, it's large media conglomerates. People distrust. There's a long kind of historic legacy of distrust for kind of anonymous, powerful institutions that have a disproportionate influence on your life. But on the grassroots level, even conservatives are more likely to trust local news because these are people who are in your community. And so that doesn't solve the whole problem, but it goes a good way toward alleviating the kind of public faith crisis we have right now.
I think one of the first presidents to really say, "Don't trust the system, trust me," was Andrew Jackson.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Speaking of what people should know, like when we're in Jacksonville, and I always am whenever I talk about kind of American history and what we don't talk about, I was like, well, do we know that General Jackson seized this territory without President Monroe's permission? At the behest of slaveholders in Georgia, who were concerned about their chattel escaping into freedom in the Spanish possession, of Florida, and so and that whole conflict, and the way that the subjugation of the so-called pacification, I think they would say, of the Seminoles was connected to this idea of eliminating a route for enslaved people to escape. Part of the same dynamic in Texas, by the way. Why Texas seceded from Mexico when the Mexican government gave that free land to Americans to come grow cotton because they saw how much the American economy was growing wealthy from cotton production. They gave them two provisos. One, that they had to convert to Catholicism, that they didn't want to import as many Protestants into Mexico, and they could not use slave labor to do it because Mexico abolished slavery in 1836. The United States didn't abolish it until 1865. And so in that context, the Americans revolted because they wanted to keep slaves. And so we don't talk about history, we'll talk about geography. Like how did these places get to be part of the United States? And so until we can get to that basic thing, and the other thing that I will say, like all of us should know, we don't, for the most part, as a nation, you can go to the most committed Republican in the country, generally does not know the history of the Republican Party. You can go to the most committed Democrat in the country, generally does not know the history of the Democratic Party. We should fundamentally know the histories of the two parties. I mean, we won't even get into all the third parties that have come and gone, in our history that are important, but just knowing how we got to the parties that we have would be a good starting place.
There's a bill going through the legislature right now filed by a Jacksonville Beach representative that would go do exactly that. But getting back to a question from the crowd.
See, that's something a reporter would know.
As a tax-paying citizen, I am in constant state of anger at how local, state, and nationally elected officials are constantly attacking the rights of Black people. What are your thoughts regarding this issue? Their words, not mine.
I don't know. I think we've been talking about them all night. Like that's pretty much, been. So I think, so here's the thing, right? I think that we have had, so when I was talking about, the importance of like history and specifically understanding the importance of like Black history, is not out of a kind of grievance place, or it's not to, as people said during the CRT discussions, to make white children feel bad about themselves or to make anybody feel bad about themselves. The importance of studying this history is as a barometer for anti-democracy in the United States. And so what has our historic tolerance for anti-democratic behavior been? And it's not the only barometer. We could study the history of women in this country. We could study the history of immigrants in this country. We could study the history of Latinos in this country. There's a whole array of people that we could look at as barometers for how far off we've been from the democratic ideal. And so in looking at the attacks on the rights of Black people, in this country, it literally becomes, well, if this can happen to us, who else can it happen to? Not that we don't matter in our own right, but I'm saying if you're just purely a self-interested person, like what else can happen as a consequence of this? And so that is something that we should be thinking about. It's something we should all be concerned about.
And we've talked about Black history. We've kind of even mentioned some of the Civil War. Question from the crowd. I'm going to read it verbatim. When Trump loses the presidential election, are you concerned that his followers will start another civil war?
So let's go back to history on this. Not even the Civil War. We have a fairly robust history of political violence in this country that we also don't talk about. And again, I know I've talked a lot about Black people. I'm going to take Black people out of the equation. Like, look at the Know Nothing Party, in the 1850s that would straight prevent entire precincts from voting. Or the Whigs in Philadelphia burned down a precinct house to prevent their opposing, I think it was Democrats, from winning an election. And so we have had, in Baltimore it was kind of notorious, on election day, there'd be fatalities. People would be shot, people would be attacked, maimed, and throughout the 19th century to prevent people from casting ballots. Like, all of that happened. The kind of organized violence that we have. There's nothing inherent that prevents us from having those kinds of problems again. And so I don't think we have a risk of the kind of 1861 to 1865 Civil War for lots of reasons. I do think that we have a pretty significant risk of protracted political violence in this country. Maybe sporadic, maybe concentrated, but certainly political violence. And that could be either if Donald Trump won or Donald Trump lost.
And another question from the crowd, I'll read it verbatim. Why are a growing number of Blacks and our younger population becoming dissatisfied with the Biden administration's policies?
I think there's a lot to that. There's a lot to pull apart. One is, people have said that the economy has rebounded. And that is really an extremely relative term. Because, again, for me, my father was an electrician, and my mother was a home health aide. And by the time I could afford the house that they raised me in, I had a PhD tenure and I had written 2 books. And so a good economy doesn't mean that they're able to move out of their parents' house. And so we are kind of floating these kind of terms relatively. Also, inflation, and the places where inflation has hit have been on the most key sectors of life. Groceries. Like, we're not just talking about what it costs for you to buy a car, we're talking about what it costs for you to buy food. If you tell people this is what a good economy looks like, especially younger people, they're going to be very skeptical about that. The other part of it is, I think that a lot of young voters always thought that Biden was a kind of, pragmatic choice. It wasn't a kind of passionate love affair. And the bloom has kind of come off the rose in these particular ways. Also, there's that huge generational gap around Gaza and Israel, and huge dissonance, there in terms of how people see those issues. And so, for all those reasons, and then the other part of it is that especially for like really young voters, it's already faded the kind of worst of what happened in the Trump administration, and so that doesn't loom in the same way that I think it might for other people. And so within that, and then the other part, and I was talking with Joy Reid about this last night, is that the Democratic Party is a big tent. It's a diverse coalition, which tends to flatten it out in some ways. There's still lots of moderate Democrats. The Republican Party has purged, its moderate members. And so in the Democratic Party, you have a left wing, you have a moderate wing, you still have, a couple of people who might even be considered conservative Democrats. And what that has done is, on average, kept the Democratic Party within certain constraints. But younger people who are further on the left are more likely to be skeptical that the party's ever going to deliver on the things they think are most important.
And wanted to go ask a couple more questions, and then from the crowd, and then we're going to conclude our evening. But wanted to ask 1 or 2 more, and these are really going to focus on journalism.
Okay.
How do you, as a man in a male-dominated industry, ensure that women's voices and interests and ideas are well represented in journalism? And this is me adding, regardless of the platform.
So here's an interesting thing. I think this is like a benefit. Maybe we can going back to Dr. Cole, but I have had more women mentors than men mentors kind of coming up in my career. I have also had significantly more female bosses than male bosses, which didn't really occur to me until we got into a conversation. I started actually counting, who were the people, who mentored me, throughout my career, and so that's always remained important to me. And one of the other things that's apparent, both in the journalism school that I lead and in the journalism profession, is that right now, and this is happening, by the way, in lots of professions, law being another, on average, the journalism school population at Columbia is about, in a close year, 65% female, 35% male. In an average year, it's probably more like 70 to 72% female population. When you get into the newsrooms, flips. And so I think that it's been beneficial for me, kind of understanding the things that I've understood through the vantage point of race by looking at how things get collated, how people get kind of ruled out. And so the other thing that I'll say that has been kind of really just eye-opening in this regard has been, the 12 years that I spent as a faculty member at Spelman, which, as you're a professor, you have lifelong kind of relationships with your students. It's astounding the extent to which the career and life options of my most brilliant students have been contingent upon, very often, the men in their lives. And so, I'm just saying this, like I have a student who I just was certain was going to be a senator, and she got married and her husband had this huge job offer and they went to where her husband's job was. And I was like, well, what about this? And you talked about running for office. And she's like, well, maybe I'll do that, some years down the line. But that has been, in another instance, one of my students wanted to go on to get an MBA, and, her husband's family was not on board with that. And instead she became a teacher, which is great. I think teaching is a great profession, but also if she had chosen, it had been her first choice to be a teacher, that would be different than saying what I really want to do is get an MBA and go into business. And so I have seen that, play out for people whose letters of recommendation I wrote. And so I've had an ear to that as a leader. So now, we had a search once, and I got the application pool, and I said, someone was like, how are the applications? And I was like, well, we have a lot of outstanding people here, but this pool looks like a urology clinic waiting room. And I was like, so I was like, we're going to get some women. I was like, we're going to get some women in this pool. Like, we're going to actually, we're not going to proceed with this pool as it is. And so we're going to make some phone calls. We're going to call people up and going to, and then, and then the last thing I'll say is that I have a very outspoken cadre of women colleagues who would keep me honest if ever I kind of wasn't doing enough to pursue gender equity. And one last thing that I'll say is that I've also been conscious of this each year as we're giving people raises. And so we have a strategy to make sure that, so we had a imbalance historically, and there's a lot of effort to kind of bring those things into parity. And so I'm bean counting. I was like, how many women do we have here? What's happening here? So on and so forth. When is this person getting promoted? And but it requires that conscious effort, because the default will push things back in the direction they had been.
And one of the things I'm so proud of that Jacksonville Today does, our editorial director is a woman, Jessica Palumbo. If you read Jacksonville Today in the morning, which I'm sure most of you do, the email comes from Jessica Palumbo. I'm also proud that we have the only Black woman who's a columnist in the entire city of Jacksonville who writes for us. We make a concerted effort to ensure the voices of all of Jacksonville are represented, not just in our reporting, but in our bylines. Wanted to ask you one more question, then we'll have a wrap-up question. Okay,
I'll give shorter answers, I promise.
Oh, no. I will give shorter questions. Let's see. As a journalist, is your goal to quote, merely, close quote, inform the readers of events and issues of import in their lives? Or is the ultimate intent a desire to inspire the readers to actively participate in affecting change with the hope of creating, I think that's the word, a more just and peaceful world?
I think it's both of those things. You know, some of the things you do to inform. And the other thing about, we've talked a lot about the weighty things, but a lot, you know, and I talked about this earlier today, when everyone was like up in arms that USA Today had hired, you know, a dedicated Taylor Swift reporter. And everyone was like, oh, you know, it's just a death knell of journalism and so on. And I was like, even when newspapers were rich, we still published astrology, you know? Like, not everything is supposed to be heavy. You know, some of it is just entertaining. You know, it's like why people come to have the relationship they have with the institution. You were going to say something.
No, I'm just laughing at the fact that of all the cities that Taylor Swift went to follow her favorite football player, Jacksonville was not one of them. I was disappointed. People said, well, did you see Taylor Swift? She didn't come.
Yeah, she
really?
didn't come.
It was the thing that appealed people to like our photos and our coverage of the NFL. Was Taylor Swift there?
But the other part of it is that this person moves the economy.
Yes.
Like, I mean, outside of the kind of like pop culture kind of references to, you know, who she's dating or what her albums are doing and so on, like this is an actual kind of factor in the economy. So, you know, there's lots of reasons that you could justify reporting.
And to be fair to the USA Today, it wasn't just a Taylor Swift reporter; it was a Beyonce reporter as well.
Yeah,
to that point that we.
Yeah, I remember people were upset about the entire thing, but you know.
So, you know, those are some wonderful questions from the audience. Those were outstanding. Thank you for submitting them. Special thanks to Kathy Waterman, the associate producer for our morning talk show, First Coast Connect, for coordinating your questions and bringing them to me. When you call in and someone says, hello, good morning, welcome to First Coast Connect, that's Kathy you're speaking with. Before we conclude, we would like to thank the Jessie duPont Fund for bringing you, Dean Cobb, to speak with us this evening. We would also like to thank Jacksonville Today supporters for making this evening possible. You can subscribe to Jacksonville Today right there. See that QR code right there? Sign up for Jacksonville Today. You can also sign up at our table next to the grand piano on your way out of the studio. And don't forget to fill out not quite yet. Don't forget to fill out the survey in your seat so we can continue to provide programming like this awesome event tonight. So thank you all for that. We're going to ask one more question as Dr. Cobb is taking a picture of all of your beautiful
No, I'm going to sign up for Jacksonville Today.
Oh, even better. Yeah. I love to see it. Thank you. Makes me sad I don't have a story in tomorrow's newsletter. But we'll conclude with this question. Your friend and colleague, Stanley Crouch, who you mentioned earlier, used to sign off correspondences by saying, victory is assured. In 2024, whose victory is assured? And what will that impact be?
So it's interesting, you know, I wrote an introduction for a posthumous collection of Stan Lee's writings, and I talked about what he meant by victory is assured, and it was kind of no one's victory is assured, but you know it's the pursuit of victory that you have control over, and that was like you're in pursuit. You know, it's like always the other title of his book, Always in Pursuit, and so I will say this. You know, James Baldwin said that the world is held together by the love of a shockingly small number of people. And you know, I found that to be true, and I always kind of say, we could say that about bravery, integrity, you know, empathy, like all of those things, you know, very small number of people have moved mountains. But I feel that when we look at history, this is the other thing that's beneficial from taking the long view, especially when you're reporting about current affairs, is that the battles behind us are bigger than the battles in front of us. That people did more with less. That people won against far longer odds than the odds that we're facing now. And the final thing is that everyone that we admire, like every single person we admire, almost universally, we admire for what they did in times of adversity. We don't admire them for what they did in times of comfort. And so when we are having second thoughts and doubts and concerns about, whether we will achieve victory, it's always best to remember the circumstances under which other people unpredictably and improbably did.
It's a fantastic way to end this evening. Everyone, please give a wonderful round of applause for Dean Jelani Cobb for joining us this evening. Dean Cobb, I so appreciate your time. Thank you so much.